A fisherman is about to lose his boat at Ostia Antica near the Vatican, his livelihood and legacy hanging by a thread. For Marco Ricci, the ancient waters that sustained generations of his family are about to slip away forever, until an unexpected visitor arrives with a plan that will change everything. The morning mist hung low over Ostia Antica's harbour, wrapping the weathered docks in a gauzy embrace that softened the edges of the world. The ancient stones, worn smooth by centuries of fishermen's boots, glistened with dew as dawn painted the sky in watercolour strokes of amber and rose. Everything about the morning felt suspended, ethereal, except for the pounding in Marco Ricci's chest as he stood on the deck of his fishing boat, La Fede. His calloused hands gripped the worn wooden railing, fingers tracing the grooves he'd memorized over decades, each notch and imperfection a timestamp of his life on these waters. The boat rocked gently beneath him, creaking a familiar lullaby he'd heard since childhood. At 68, Marco's face was a map of sun-carved lines, eyes the same deep blue as the Mediterranean he'd fished for over 50 years. The sound of leather shoes on the wooden dock broke the morning spell. Marco turned to see a man approaching. Crisp. Navy suit, polished briefcase, expression efficiently neutral. Too clean for this place of salt and scale and honest work. "Signor Ricci?" the man called, voice clipped and formal. "Matteo Conte, from Banco Nazionale." Marco straightened his weathered cap, suddenly conscious of his faded work clothes and the smell of fish that never quite washed away. "I'm Ricci," he answered, his voice rough from years of calling over wind and wave. The banker extended a thick, manila envelope. "I'm here to deliver the final notice regarding your outstanding loan." His tone was practiced, almost mechanical. "As discussed in our previous communications, payment in full is required within 30 days, or La Fede will be repossessed per the terms of your agreement." Marco didn't immediately take the envelope. Instead, he looked past the banker to where the rising sun now illuminated the harbour's edge, where his father had taught him to mend nets, where his grandfather had shown him how to read the water's mood. 3 generations of Riccis had stepped from this dock onto this boat. 30 days, Marco finally murmured, taking the envelope with a hand that refused to tremble. "I recommend you consider all available options," the banker added, his gaze softening momentarily. "The fishing industry here is challenging these days." Marco nodded silently as the banker retreated down the dock, the sound of those leather shoes growing fainter, until once again it was just Marco, his boat, and the weight of an impossible choice sitting heavy as an anchor in his hands. Marco's small stone house stood less than a quarter-mile from the harbour, a modest 2-story structure that had withstood Mediterranean storms for over a century. Inside, the late afternoon sunlight filtered through faded blue curtains, casting gentle shadows across walls adorned with decades of memories. Wedding photographs in simple wooden frames. His wife, Lucia, gone 5 years now. His son, Antonio, at various ages, holding his first fish, graduating university, waving from New York's skyline. Marco set his worn canvas bag by the door and collapsed into his favorite chair, the envelope from the bank still clutched in his hand. He hadn't opened it yet. Truth lived in unopened things, suspended between possibility and certainty. "Nonno?" Sophia's voice called from upstairs, followed by the quick patter of teenage feet on wooden stairs. "I thought I heard you come in." His granddaughter appeared, in the doorway, 17 and vibrant, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing her school uniform and her grandmother's old silver anchor necklace. Since coming to live with him 3 years ago, Sophia had filled the house with a life Marco had forgotten it could hold. "Just resting my eyes," Marco replied, quickly tucking the envelope beneath a cushion. Sophia frowned, too perceptive. "Bad. A day at sea. The sea is never bad," Marco corrected gently. "Just quiet today. The phone rang, saving him from further questions. Sophia answered, her face brightening. "Papa, yes, he's right here." She handed the phone to Marco. "It's Dad calling from New York." Marco took the receiver, prepared for the conversation they'd been having in fragments for months now. "Antonio, how are things?" "Dad, have you thought more about what we discussed?" Antonio's voice came through clear despite the distance, his Italian still perfect, but now edged with American directness. "The restaurant is doing well. We could use your expertise here. You could sell the boat, have enough for a comfortable life." Marco closed his eyes. "A fisherman without his boat is like a bird without wings. The fishing is dying there, Papa. You're working twice as hard for half the catch." Sophia had wandered to the coffee table where Marco had set his bag. Her expression changed as she pulled out a piece of paper that had slipped from the envelope. The bank's notice, with its official letterhead and final warnings highlighted in yellow. "You know what Nonno Mario used to say," Marco continued, watching Sophia's face fall as she read. "A Ricci belongs to the sea." "Nonno Mario didn't have to compete with commercial trawlers," Antonio countered. "Times change. You could have a new start here." Sophia's eyes met Marco's, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. "I'll think about it," Marco said finally, though both knew it was just words. After goodbyes, Marco hung up. The silence between him and Sophia stretched, filled with unspoken questions. 30 days, she finally asked, her voice smaller than usual. Marco nodded. "The sea has been less generous lately." Sophia sat beside him, shoulders touching. "What happens if we lose the boat?" "Not if," Marco corrected gently. "When?" The horizon bled orange and gold as La Fed cut through waters that had cradled generations of Ricci men. Marco stood at the helm, his body moving with the gentle pitch and roll of his vessel as naturally as breathing. 20 kilometers off Ostia's ancient coastline, these fishing grounds had sustained his family for over a century. The boat's motor hummed steadily, a counterpoint to the lapping waves and crying gulls that had formed the soundtrack of Marco's life. "You're thinking too loud again, old friend," came a gravelly voice from behind. Giuseppe Palmieri, 73 and weathered as driftwood, stepped beside Marco. The two had fished these waters together since they were boys, trailing after their fathers. Giuseppe's own boat had been sold 3 years ago, but he still joined Marco when his arthritis permitted. "Just listening to the sea," Marco replied, adjusting their course slightly. "She's quiet today?" Giuseppe nodded, scanning the dawn-lit waters. "Too quiet for too long." They both looked toward the horizon where massive silhouettes broke the clean line between sea and sky. Commercial fishing vessels with nets that could swallow Marco's entire boat. Technology that found fish before they had a chance to hide. Crews that worked day and night. "Third day this week they've been here," Marco observed, his voice tight. "Used to be they stayed in deeper waters." Giuseppe's laugh was dry as salt. "Used to be a lot of things, Marco." They worked in practiced tandem, dropping nets at precisely the spots Marco's grandfather had marked in a weathered journal. Places where currents met, where certain rocks created shelter, where fish had gathered for centuries. The methods hadn't changed since Roman times. Read the water, respect its rhythms, take only what was needed. Hours later, as they hauled in their catch, the meager results confirmed what both already knew. Fish that should have filled 3 crates barely covered the bottom of one. "My father could fill a boat in half a day," Marco said, examining a silver-scaled branzino before placing it carefully in the ice. "Now we work twice as long for a quarter of the catch." Giuseppe glanced toward the commercial vessels. "Progress, they call it? Is it progress when something beautiful dies?" Marco asked, more to the sea than his friend. They worked in silence. The familiar movements, a dance practiced over decades, checking lines, sorting catch, preparing for the journey. "But Marco's hands moved automatically while his mind calculated what today's meager haul would bring at market. Not enough. Never enough anymore. Sophia asked about the boat yesterday, Marco said eventually. After the bank notice came, Giuseppe's eyes, still sharp as an osprey's, met Marco's. What will you tell her? What can I tell her? That 4 generations of Riccis have fed their families from these waters, but I'll be the last? Marco's voice cracked slightly. That her great-grandfather taught her grandfather, who taught her father, who taught me, and the line ends here? The only answer was the gentle slap of waves against the hull and the distant mechanical hum of the commercial fleet. A reminder that some tides cannot be turned back. Santa Maria's stone walls had witnessed 17 centuries of prayers, standing, steadfast against time, just as they had against Ostia's salt-laden winds. Sunday morning light filtered through ancient stained glass, casting kaleidoscope patterns across wooden pews, now emptying after Mass. Marco remained seated, his weather-worn cap resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the flickering votive candles near the altar. 21 days remained. The number haunted his dreams, ticked away in his thoughts with each sunrise. You stayed behind today, Marco? Father Antonio's voice was gentle as he slid into the pew beside him. In his early 50s, the priest had a fisherman's son's hands. Despite his 30 years in clerical service, strong, capable, understanding the language of work. Just thinking, Father. Marco's eyes remained on the dancing flames. About the boat? Father Antonio asked, his directness born of a 2-decade friendship. Marco's silence was answer enough. Sophia mentioned something after her confirmation class. The priest continued. The bank notice! Marco sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. News travels fast in small harbors. Faster in churches, Father Antonio replied with a small smile. Have you considered asking for help? Pride flashed across Marco's weathered features. A Ricci has never taken charity. Not charity, Father Antonio corrected. Community. The fishermen of Ostia Antica have supported each other for centuries. Marco shook his head. Giuseppe lost his boat 3 years ago. Stefano last year. The Moretti brothers the year before that. Everyone is struggling. The church fell silent, except for the distant call of gulls through open windows. Father Antonio seemed to be considering something, his fingers tracing the worn wood of the pew. You know I served at the Vatican before coming here, he said finally. I still have connections there. Marco looked up, confused by this sudden change in conversation. The new Pope, Leo XIV, he's different from his predecessors, Father Antonio continued. He's spoken several times about preserving traditional communities, especially those connected to Italy's maritime heritage. What does the Pope care about one old fisherman's boat? Marco asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Perhaps more than you think, Father Antonio replied. He grew up in a coastal village near Naples. His father was a boat builder. Marco's expression remained skeptical. His recent encyclical specifically mentioned the importance of traditional fishing practices as both cultural heritage and environmental stewardship. Father Antonio leaned forward. What if we wrote to him, Marco? Explained your situation? Marco stood abruptly, shaking his head. The Pope has more important matters than my troubles. Perhaps, Father Antonio acknowledged, rising slowly. But sometimes God works through the most unexpected channels. Marco placed his cap back on his head, the weight of his pride and his desperation battling visibly across his face. I need to solve this myself, Father. A man should stand on his own feet. Even Christ accepted help carrying his cross, Marco, Father Antonio said quietly as the fisherman turned to leave. Think about it. We have 3 weeks. The wooden shed stood at the edge of Marco's property, weathered planks silvered by decades of sun and salt. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light that penetrated through gaps in the walls. The space smelled of hemp rope, tar, and the lingering ghost of countless catches, a perfume no store could bottle, the scent of a fisherman's life. Marco sat hunched on a three-legged stool, fingers working methodically through a damaged net spread across his knees. 18 days remained. Each knot he tied felt like another second ticking away. Another breath closer to the end. The door creaked open, and Sophia's slender silhouette appeared against the glare of sunlight. "Nonna Lucia always said you hide here when you're troubled," she said, stepping inside. Marco didn't look up. "I'm not hiding, I'm working." Sophia moved carefully through the cramped space, navigating around coils of rope, plastic bins of hooks, and tools that had belonged to Marco's father and grandfather before him. "I thought you might want some water," she said, placing a glass bottle beside him. "It's hot today." Marco nodded his thanks, but continued his work. His silence was a wall Sophia had grown accustomed to scaling. "We learned about sustainable fishing practices in school yesterday," she said, picking up a cork float and turning it in her hands. "How traditional methods are actually better for preserving fish populations." "Books don't catch fish," Marco replied, his voice flat. Sophia set down the float and moved toward the back of the shed, where stacked wooden crates held miscellaneous supplies. "Where's that old chest with great-grandpa's things? I need something for my history project." Marco gestured vaguely toward a dark corner. "Under the canvas. Don't make a mess." Sophia pulled away a faded tarp, revealing a sea chest of dark wood bound with brass. As she lifted the heavy lid, the smell of old paper and leather rose to meet her. Inside lay the artifacts of generations, navigational tools, faded photographs, small carved figurines of boats and fish. "What's this?" she asked, lifting a leather-bound journal with pages swollen from decades of sea air. Marco glanced up briefly. "My notebook from university, before I took over the boat." Sophia's fingers carefully turned the brittle pages. Her eyes widened at the detailed drawings, diagrams of nets with adjustable mesh sizes, sketches of underwater habitats, charts tracking fish migration patterns, designs for modified equipment. Between these were paragraphs of passionate writing, equations and economic projections. "No," she breathed, "these are amazing. You designed a whole sustainable fishing system." Marco's hands stilled on the net. "Dreams from another life." Sophia continued turning pages. "But these ideas, they're exactly what my professor talked about. Selective fishing that preserves younger fish, rotating fishing grounds to prevent depletion." She looked up at him. "You were thinking about this 30 years ago. And what good did it do?" Marco asked, bitterness edging his voice. "No one wanted to listen then. The big companies came, took everything, and now—" He gestured helplessly. Sophia clutched the journal to her chest, a sudden light in her eyes. "Father Antonio needs to see this. Maybe this is what he meant about writing to the Pope." Marco shook his head, but something had changed in his expression. A tiny crack in the wall of his resignation. A small ember rekindling in the ashes of his hope. Father Antonio's office smelled of old books, candle wax, and the lemon polish that Sister Maria insisted on using, despite the priest's protestations that the ancient desk was beyond salvation. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the narrow window, illuminating dust motes and the anxious faces of Sophia and the priest as they huddled over Marco's journal. "These are remarkable," Father Antonio murmured, turning pages with reverent care. "Your grandfather was decades ahead of his time," Sophia nodded, fidgeting with her grandmother's anchor necklace. "Can you help us? The bank takes the boat in 12 days. The priest closed the journal thoughtfully. "Getting this to the Pope directly, it's not simple. The Vatican receives thousands of letters daily." "But you said you have connections," Sophia pressed, leaning forward. "You said Pope Leo cares." About fishing communities, Father Antonio rubbed his forehead. I know Cardinal Bianchi, who oversees the Pontifical Council for Culture. If I send this through him, it might reach the Holy Father. The door opened as Sister Carmela, the church secretary, entered with a tray of espresso. At 74, she moved with the efficient precision of someone who had served the same parish for 4 decades. You look troubled, Father, she observed, setting down the tray. Her sharp eyes noted the journal, the photographs of Lafayette spread across the desk, Sophia's anxious expression. We're attempting the impossible, sister, Father Antonio sighed. My specialty, she replied dryly, pouring coffee into tiny cups. Father. Antonio explained the situation while Sister Carmela listened, her lined face impassive. When he finished, she simply nodded once. My cousin's daughter works in Cardinal Luzzato's office, she said matter-of-factly. The Pope's personal secretary. She can ensure it reaches his desk. Sophia's eyes widened. Really? 40 years in the church teaches you that God works through relationships, not bureaucracy, Sister Carmela said with a shrug. But we must hurry. It takes time for even God's wheels to turn. Father Antonio reached for paper and pen. We'll need to write a cover letter explaining the situation, the bank's deadline, and include photos of the boat, the harbor, my grandfather, Sophia added quickly. So it's not just words on paper. For the next 2 hours, they assembled their package, the precious journal carefully wrapped, photographs showing 4 generations of Ricci fishermen, a map of the traditional fishing grounds now dominated by commercial vessels, and a letter explaining Marco's vision for sustainable fishing that honored both tradition and conservation. My grandfather doesn't know we're doing this, Sophia admitted as Father Antonio sealed the large envelope. His pride. Pride is both the greatest virtue and the deadliest sin, the priest replied gently. Sometimes we must act on behalf of those we love. Sister Carmela took the package, her gnarled hands surprisingly steady. I'll call my cousin today. But remember, she cautioned, even with connections, even with prayers, there are no guarantees. Father Antonio nodded solemnly. Faith isn't about guarantees, sister. It's about hope in the face of impossible odds. Sophia touched the envelope one last time before Sister Carmela took it away. 12 days, she whispered. Please hurry. The sky over Ostia Harbour blushed rose and gold, the sun not yet fully risen. Above the Mediterranean horizon, Marco moved methodically across the deck of La Fede, checking lines and preparing for what might be his last week of fishing before the bank claimed his inheritance. 4 days remained. The countdown had become a physical presence, a shadow following his every move. Sophia appeared on the dock, carrying a thermos of coffee and a small package of breakfast for Caccia. She'd been unusually attentive these past days, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between hope and secrecy. You're up early, Marco observed as she handed him the provisions. Couldn't sleep, she replied, scanning the harbour with unusual intensity. Marco followed her gaze. Something wrong? No, she said quickly, too quickly. Just watching the sunrise. The distant purr of engines drew their attention toward the harbour entrance, where a small motorcade of 3 modest black vehicles approached the waterfront. No flashing lights, no sirens, just a quiet procession that seemed oddly out of place among the weathered fishing boats. Strange, Marco murmured. Tourists don't usually come this early. Sophia's breath caught as the vehicles stopped at the harbour's edge. From the centre car emerged a white-haired man in simple black clothing with just a touch of white at his collar. No elaborate robes, no entourage of cardinals, but unmistakably Pope Leo XIV, accompanied only by 2 plainclothes security men and a younger priest carrying a leather portfolio. Blessed Mother of God, Marco whispered, hand instinctively making the sign of the cross. The Pope glanced around briefly before his eyes settled on La Fede. With purpose in his stride, he walked directly toward them, his smile warm beneath keen eyes that missed nothing. "Signor Ricci," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the morning-still harbor. "Marco Ricci?" Marco stood frozen, cap clutched suddenly in trembling hands. Sophia nudged him gently. "Si, Santo Padre," Marco managed, voice barely audible. "I am Marco Ricci." The Pope stepped onto the dock beside La Fede, extending his hand not for the traditional kiss, but for a fisherman's handshake. "I hope you'll forgive the early hour and unexpected visit." Marco took the offered hand automatically, his weathered fingers closing around the Pope's. Your Holiness, I don't understand. I received a rather compelling package," Pope Leo explained, gesturing to the portfolio his aide carried. "Your granddaughter's letter, your journal, your vision for sustainable fishing that honors both tradition and future." He glanced at Sophia with a knowing smile. Some voices deserve to be heard, even when they don't seek an audience. Sophia looked down, a blush coloring her cheeks. "You came here for my boat?" Marco asked, disbelief evident in every syllable. "I came for your story," the Pope corrected gently, "and to see for myself the waters you've written about with such wisdom and love." He looked around at the harbor, at the ancient coastline, at the same sea that had witnessed 2,000 years of Roman history. "Would you be willing to show me, Signor Ricci, to help me understand what's being lost?" Marco blinked rapidly, emotions washing across his face like waves against the shore. Disbelief, embarrassment, confusion, and finally, a flicker of something that looked remarkably like hope. "My boat is humble, Your Holiness," he said quietly. Pope Leo smiled. "So were the boats of the first apostles." Ancient stones warmed under the strengthening morning sun as Marco led Pope Leo through the ruins of Ostia Antica. The harbor that once received ships from across the Roman Empire now stood as a testament to time's passage. Crumbling columns, mosaic floors opened to the sky, and pathways that had felt the tread of emperors. Security personnel maintained a respectful distance, allowing the small group a rare moment of privacy. "My ancestors fished these waters when Rome was still building its first aqueducts," Marco said, his initial shock gradually giving way to a quiet pride. He pointed toward a worn stone relief depicting fishing boats. "This carving shows the same net design my grandfather taught me to use." Pope Leo studied the ancient artwork, nodding thoughtfully. 2,000 years, and the fundamentals remain. "Unchanged. The fundamentals, yes," Marco agreed, his weathered hand tracing the stone's outline. "But now we face challenges our ancestors couldn't imagine." They walked in silence for several moments, passing through the ruins toward the modern harbor. Sophia followed a few steps behind, watching her grandfather's shoulders gradually loosen as the Pope asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. "Your journal mentions techniques passed through generations," Pope Leo said. "Tell me about these traditions." Marco hesitated, decades of keeping his thoughts private warring with the Pope's evident interest. "It's nothing special, Your Holiness." "I disagree," the Pope countered gently. "Knowledge preserved through family, through practice rather than text. This is living heritage." Something in the Pope's tone breached Marco's reserve. "My great-grandfather could read the sea like others read books," he began, voice strengthening. "He taught my grandfather how to listen to water, how certain fish move with the phases of the moon, how to find the places where currents meet and life gathers." As they reached the modern harbor, Marco pointed to spots on the horizon explaining, "Underwater formations known only to local fishermen, seasonal patterns observed over centuries, and the delicate balance of taking only what the sea could replenish. The commercial boats," he continued, gesturing toward distant silhouettes, "they take everything at once. They don't understand that some grounds need to rest, that certain areas are nurseries for young fish. Like a garden that needs fallow. Seasons, the Pope observed. Exactly, Marco nodded, surprise evident in his face at being so quickly understood. My journal, the one Sophia sent. It was my attempt to combine what my fathers taught me with what I learned studying marine biology, before I had to leave university to take over the family boat. Pope Leo looked at Sophia, who watched her grandfather with shining eyes. Your granddaughter seems proud of this legacy. Marco glanced at Sophia with sudden tenderness. She deserves a future, not just stories of the past. Perhaps they aren't as separate as you think, the Pope replied, his gaze returning to where La Fede rocked gently in the morning light. Your family has preserved wisdom that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. He paused, considering something. Would you show me your boat now, Marco? Not as a visitor, but as someone who wishes to understand. Marco nodded, a subtle change in his demeanor, as if in sharing his story, some burden had begun to lift. This way, Your Holiness. Mind your step on the dock. The ancient Romans built things to last, but these modern boards need replacing every few years. The Pope smiled, following Marco toward La Fede with the attention of a man who recognized that what was being shared was not just information, but a life's devotion. The conference room within the Vatican's administrative wing carried the weight of centuries in its vaulted ceiling and marble floors, though the long mahogany table and ergonomic chairs spoke to more modern sensibilities. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked St. Peter's Square, where tourists gathered like schools of colorful fish in the afternoon sun. Inside, a different gathering had formed. 12 of the Vatican's most influential advisors seated in ascending order of seniority, portfolios open before them, expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. Pope Leo XV entered, without ceremony, carrying Marco's journal himself, rather than having an aide bring it. The assembled advisors rose, then settled back into their seats as the Pope took his place at the head of the table. Thank you for assembling on such short notice, he began, his voice carrying the same warmth he had shown on Ostia's docks, though, now weighted with authority. I've asked you here to discuss an urgent matter of both cultural preservation and environmental stewardship. Cardinal Bonetti, who oversaw Vatican finances, shifted uncomfortably. Your Holiness, if this concerns the fisherman situation in Ostia, I've reviewed the preliminary proposal. While touching, it falls outside our established investment parameters. Parameters, the Pope repeated thoughtfully, opening Marco's journal to a page marked with a simple ribbon. Tell me, what parameters guided St. Peter when he cast his nets? Subtle tension rippled through the room. The Church has financial responsibilities, offered Monsignor Rossi, a pragmatic financial advisor with rectangular glasses and a reputation for fiscal conservatism. Our charitable endeavors must be sustainable themselves. Pope Leo nodded. Sustainability. The very word brings me to our discussion. He turned the journal toward them, revealing Marco's detailed sketches and notes. 4 generations of knowledge, preserved by one family, techniques that maintained fish populations for centuries until modern industrial methods began depleting what was once thought inexhaustible. Dr. Valentina Esposito, the Vatican's environmental science consultant, leaned forward with sudden interest. Those selective net designs, they're remarkably similar to what marine conservation groups are now advocating. Precisely, the Pope agreed. This fisherman developed these concepts 30 years ago, combining traditional knowledge with formal education, knowledge that will be lost in less than 4 days when his boat is repossessed. Cardinal Bonetti sighed. With respect, Your Holiness, we cannot intervene in every unfortunate financial situation among the faithful. I'm not proposing charity, Pope Leo countered, his voice firming. I am proposing investment in wisdom that cannot be replaced. in sustainable practices the world desperately needs. He turned to his aide, who distributed folders to each advisor. A pilot program, the Vatican-sponsored Tiber Heritage Maritime Conservation Initiative. The room fell silent as the advisors reviewed the hastily prepared documents. This proposes acquiring not just Ricci's boat, but 3 additional vessels from traditional fishing families, Monsignor Rossi noted, eyebrows rising, creating a living maritime museum and sustainable fishing education center. With research, partnerships with 3 universities, Dr. Esposito added, her expression brightening. This could become a model for similar programs throughout the Mediterranean. Cardinal Bonetti closed his folder deliberately. The budget requirements are substantial, the precedent concerning. And the cost of losing this knowledge? Pope Leo asked quietly. Of allowing another cultural tradition to vanish? He looked around the table. The Church has always taken the long view of history. What will history say of us if we stand by while the seas are emptied and ancient wisdom is forgotten? The silence that followed held both resistance and contemplation. Then, slowly, Dr. Esposito spoke. I believe this has scientific merit that extends beyond cultural preservation, she said. These traditional methods could inform modern conservation efforts. Pope Leo's gaze returned to Cardinal Bonetti, who had served 3 popes with unwavering loyalty to both tradition and fiscal responsibility. 2 days, the Cardinal said finally. Give me 2 days to revise the financials. The Pope nodded once, relief visible only in the slight easing of his shoulders. Marco Ricci has given his life to the sea. The sea has 3 days to give his life back to him. La Fede had never looked so festive, her weathered hull adorned with garlands of fresh flowers and strings of small Italian flags that snapped cheerfully in the breeze. The ancient dock creaked under the weight of what seemed like half of Ostia gathered to witness something no one quite understood, but everyone sensed was important. Children perched on parents' shoulders. Elderly fishermen stood with arms crossed in curious anticipation, and a small contingent of media adjusted cameras and microphones at the edges of the crowd. Marco stood at the helm of his boat, uncomfortable, in a freshly pressed shirt that Sophia had insisted upon. His calloused hands fidgeted with his cap, turning it around and around as he surveyed the gathering with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. I never wanted all this attention, he murmured. To Giuseppe, who stood beside him in solidarity, I just wanted to keep my boat. Sometimes God has bigger plans than our small prayers, Giuseppe replied, patting his friend's shoulder. A respectful hush fell over the crowd as Pope Leo XIV arrived, walking the same path he had traveled 4 days earlier, though now accompanied by several Vatican officials in formal attire. He boarded La Fede with the ease of a man who had spent his childhood around boats, nodding warmly to Marco before turning to address the assembled community. Good people of Ostia, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the harbour. We gather today, not just to save one man's livelihood, but to preserve a living heritage that connects us to our ancestors and to the sea that has sustained Italy for millennia. Marco shifted his weight uneasily as all eyes moved between him and the Pope. Sophia, standing nearby, gave him an encouraging smile. Today, Pope Leo continued, the Vatican is proud to announce the creation of the Guardians of the Tiber Maritime Initiative, a program that recognizes traditional fishing families as both cultural treasures and environmental stewards. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the Pope gestured to Marco. Signor Ricci's family has fished these waters for 4 generations, preserving techniques that modern science now recognizes as vital for sustainable marine conservation. His boat, La Fede Faith, will become the flagship of this new initiative, which will combine traditional fishing knowledge with environmental education. Marco's eyes widened as he began to understand the full scope of what was happening. The program will initially include 4 traditional fishing vessels, the Pope explained, creating a living museum and research center dedicated to preserving coastal heritage while developing sustainable fishing practices for the future. He turned to Marco. Signor Ricci, the Vatican wishes to commission La Fede and her captain to lead this initiative. Not as an employee, but as a teacher, a guardian of wisdom that must not be lost. Marco stood frozen, overwhelmed. Behind him, Giuseppe whispered, "Say something, old friend." Marco cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Your Holiness, I'm just a simple fisherman." As were the apostles, Pope Leo smiled, "and they changed the world." A small child's voice called from the crowd, "Does this mean Signor Ricci keeps his boat?" Pope Leo's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "It means, little one, that this boat now belongs to history, and history belongs to all of us." Marco looked out at the gathered faces, neighbors who had watched his struggle, fellow fishermen who had suffered similar fates, Sophia, whose eyes shone with tears of pride, and felt something shift within him. The burden of solitary struggle lifting, replaced by the weight of a different responsibility: preservation, education, community. "I accept," he said simply, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. "For my fathers before me, and the children who will come after." The Pope nodded, satisfied as applause erupted from the shore. And for the first time in months, La Fede seemed to sit higher in the water, as if the burden of uncertainty had been lifted from her timbers as surely as it had been lifted from her captain's heart. Summer sunlight danced across the newly renovated fishing center that had once been an abandoned warehouse on Ostia's harbor. Fresh paint in Mediterranean blue trimmed the windows, while the Vatican's emblem and the program's new logo, a stylized boat encircled by the words Guardiani del Tevere, hung above the entrance. Inside, the cavernous space hummed with activity, the smell of salt and fresh wood mingling with voices both young and old. Marco stood at a large wooden table where a dozen children gathered around him, their eyes wide as his weathered hands manipulated cord into the intricate patterns of a traditional fishing net. "Not so tight," he instructed, guiding a young boy's fingers. "The net must breathe with the water, must dance with the fish, not fight against them." Sophia moved between the tables, distributing materials and translating Marco's instructions into English for 2 visiting marine biology students who scribbled notes furiously. In the 3 months since the program's announcement, the center had become a hub of activity, part museum, part research facility, part classroom, all centered around the wisdom Marco had once believed would die with him. "Nonno," Sophia called, approaching with a young woman in a crisp white shirt. "Dr. Marino from the university has questions about the seasonal migration patterns you mentioned." Marco looked up from the net, hesitation flickering across his features. The academic world still felt foreign to him, his knowledge born of hands and heart rather than books and laboratories. "Your grandfather's observations about the currents near the ancient harbor ruins align perfectly with our satellite data," Dr. Marino explained, spreading a map across the table. "But we're seeing discrepancies in the northern quadrant. The fish aren't following predicted patterns." Marco studied the map, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Your predictions are based on old patterns. The commercial trawlers changed the seabed there 3 years ago, destroyed the underwater structure where the small fish used to shelter." "Exactly what our sonar suggested." Dr. Marino nodded enthusiastically. "Can you show me the traditional routes your family used before the damage?" As Marco marked the map with a pencil, Sophia watched her grandfather's transformation, the reluctant fisherman becoming a teacher, the keeper of dying knowledge becoming its most passionate advocate. Across the room, Giuseppe worked with another group, showing them how to repair rather than replace damaged equipment, a sustainability practice born of necessity but perfectly aligned with modern conservation principles. Signor Ricci, called a young environmental researcher, could we document the selective net technique you mentioned, the one your journal described that allows juvenile fish to escape? Marco glanced at the half-finished net in his hands, then at the eager faces surrounding him. Better than documentation, he replied. I'll teach you how to make one. Later, as afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, Marco stood alone at the center's back doorway, watching La Fede rock gently. At her mooring, the boat now carried sophisticated monitoring equipment alongside traditional fishing gear, a marriage of past and future that had initially troubled him but now filled him with quiet pride. Sophia appeared at his side, following his gaze. "What are you thinking, nonno?" Marco placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm thinking that your grandmother would hardly recognize me now, teaching university people, talking about satellite data." He chuckled softly. "And I'm thinking that my father and his father before him would be proud to see our ways living on, even if everything looks different." "Not everything," Sophia replied, her hand covering his. "The most important things stay the same." From inside came the sound of children's laughter as they mastered the ancient art of net-making, their small hands keeping alive what machines had nearly destroyed, human connection to the sea, passed down one knot at a time. The Mediterranean painted itself in strokes of crimson and gold as the sun descended toward the horizon, casting La Fede in a warm glow that softened her weathered edges and highlighted the careful repairs made throughout the past year. Marco stood at the helm, his familiar position now shared with Sophia, who had grown from reluctant student to confident co-captain. The deck behind them hummed with quiet activity as community members and program participants prepared for the anniversary celebration, stringing lights along the railings and arranging simple wooden benches. "1 year," Marco said softly, more to himself than to Sophia. "Sometimes I still wake up expecting to find the repossession notice." Sophia smiled, adjusting a setting on the new navigational equipment that now sat alongside traditional tools in the boat's cabin. "Instead, you wake up to a waiting list of students and researchers." Marco nodded, his eyes traveling across the harbor where 3 additional boats now displayed the Guardiani del Tevere emblem, Giuseppe's recently repurchased vessel among them. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one man's livelihood had blossomed into a program that had breathed new life into Ostia's traditional fishing community. The sound of a familiar voice drew their attention to the dock, where Pope Leo XIV approached with the same unassuming manner of his first visit, though this time expected and welcomed. Marco moved to help him aboard, noting how the Pope's eyes took in every detail of the transformed vessel. "Your Holiness," Marco greeted him, bowing slightly. "Welcome back to La Fede." "She looks well," the Pope observed, his hand running appreciatively along the freshly varnished railing. "As do you, my friend." Inside the cabin, now serving as both classroom and navigation center, Pope Leo paused before a wall that had once held only faded photographs of Marco's ancestors. Now these family mementos shared space with framed scientific papers co-authored by Marco, newspaper articles about the program's success, and at the center, a simple letter on Vatican stationery. "In waters fished since Roman times, wisdom passes, from hand to hand, heart to heart. May the faith that names this vessel guide all who learn from her captain. Leo XIV." "You've honored our agreement beautifully," the Pope said, nodding towards several charts showing recovered fish populations in traditional grounds. "The universities report that your methods have already shown measurable improvements." "Sea responds when treated with respect," Marco replied simply. As the evening progressed, La Fede welcomed dozens of visitors, local children who had learned net-making in Marco's classes, fishermen who had scoffed at the program but now came seeking advice, scientists whose data validated what generations of Riccis had known through observation and tradition. Under the string lights, with the ancient harbour ruins silhouetted against the darkening sky, Sophia addressed the gathered crowd, her grandmother's anchor necklace catching the light as she spoke of the program's expansion to other coastal communities. Later, as stars appeared above the quieting celebration, Marco found himself alone at the bow with Pope Leo. "When you first came to my boat," Marco said, "I thought you were offering charity. Now I understand it was something else entirely." "What did I offer, Marco?" the Pope asked gently. Marco looked towards Sophia, now deep in conversation with a marine biology student who had travelled from Australia to study traditional Mediterranean fishing methods. "Recognition," he answered finally, "that some treasures can't be measured in money. That wisdom isn't just found in books or laboratories." He paused, searching for words. "You helped me see that what I thought was ending was actually a beginning." Pope Leo nodded, his gaze following Marco's to Sophia. "And what does the future hold for the Ricci fishing tradition?" Marco smiled, the deep creases around his eyes speaking of both past hardships and present contentment. "Sophia starts university next month. Marine biology and cultural preservation. She says someone needs to translate between the old ways and the new science." Pride warmed his voice. "But she'll still sail with me when classes allow. She says the sea is in her blood." As night fully claimed the sky, La Fede rocked gently in her familiar mooring, no longer simply a fishing vessel, or even just a classroom, but a bridge between generations, between tradition and innovation, between what was almost lost and what had been saved. Like the faith that gave her name, she had weathered storms and emerged stronger, carrying precious cargo more valuable than any fish, living knowledge, preserved for those who would come after.